Hades, just like everything that Supergiant Games makes, is filled to the brim with observations about you, the player. There's one I really like in the first boss fight with Meg, for example, that begins with this line.
That mirror's made you stronger, Zagreus. You're fortunate to have Nyx helping you.
She's basically telling Zag here that he wouldn't stand a chance against her without all of those upgrades that you've steadily been unlocking for him as you play. It's a pretty solid burn, to be honest. However, if you then on your next run remove all of those upgrades, which almost nobody will ever do by the way, she references that in the next fight.
I sense something different about you, Zagreus. Your old weakness. Ah, the mirror. I thought you said you weren't trying to compete with me.
It's a tiny, tiny detail and one that I can't imagine many players will ever experience firsthand, but if you do, man, that's pretty great. Now, Supergiant has spent the last decade creating games that do exactly this, that tell their players, hey, we see you, we care about what you're doing right now, even the seemingly unimportant stuff. In fact, especially that stuff. It's why Bastion's narrator says things like,
"Kid better watch his step."
It's why Transistor jokes about you taking too long to figure out a puzzle.
Let's pretend that never happened.
And it's why the text in Pyre doesn't just say you won your last right, it describes it as a one-sided contest. But the studio's latest title, Hades, belongs to a genre that isn't typically associated with the kind of storytelling we expect from Hades. Roguelikes, by their very nature, are all about failure, repeated failure, with the player needing to start all over again from scratch whenever they mess up too badly. And that process provides a significant challenge to the narrative if every time the player messes up, Hades, just like everything that Supergiant Games makes, is filled to the brim with observations about you, the player. I am just kidding, but you get the idea. Imagine two players, right? One of them somehow rolls the credits on Hades after their 10th run with just 5 hours spent playing the game, while the other won't get there until their 100th attempt, and with 40 hours on the clock. How do you possibly provide a compelling narrative arc that works for both of these players? Well, here's one bad option that comes to mind. You could make sure that your story works for player 1 and their perfect playthrough, and then use that exact same structure for player 2 as well, but only offer up new dialogue and new story beats when they actually make some form of progress. In the meantime, I don't know, just repeat whatever they've heard already. But here's the thing about Hades. If you know anything about this game, you'll know that Theseus is a piece of shit, just a really bad man. I'm really sorry, that wasn't the point I was supposed to make. You'll know that Hades does an amazing job at offering up brand new dialogue all the time, and even after dozens of hours, most players will have never heard a single line be repeated. So how has Supergiant pulled that off? Well, the answer to that question begins with the game's script. It's 300,000 words long, which, by the way, is a bigger word count than the Game of Thrones, and you know George R.R. doesn't write a short tale. And according to Supergiant's Greg Kasavin, at least 2/3 of that script is fully voiced.
I did not expect that Hades would end up with a bigger script than Pyre, because Pyre is a very story-heavy game before it, but that's how it ended up.
But sheer quantity of words isn't enough on its own to solve that bigger problem of players progressing through Hades at different speeds. Not if Supergiant want their game to respond to those players and their progress in a way that feels personal.
And what we did was we embraced the randomness inherent to the roguelike genre, even for the narrative.
So what does that mean? Well, when Zagreus runs up to Nyx, for example, and begins talking with her, there's a long list of possible conversations that can be triggered in that moment. There's plenty more than you can see here, but let's pretend for now that there are just 6. The game essentially rolls a dice and then uses that random number to decide which one of these it's going to use.
Nyx, I have to ask you something.
Once that conversation has been exhausted, it's then taken out of the pool until the player has gone through all the other possible options. Only then can it be reset and potentially heard once again.
The thing is, if it were always random, it would be kind of nonsensical. So we developed a system that can check increasingly specific conditions. So one of them may be, you have this weapon. One of them may be, you failed to clear the last escape attempt. One of them may be, you have a fish. One of them may be, you have achieved the maximum relationship level with Thanatos, etc., etc.
Okay, so if we return to that conversation with Nyx, there's actually 2 categories to consider then. There's the oven-ready stuff that can be used at any point during a playthrough, and then there's this locked dialogue which can only be added into that mix when the correct requirements have been fulfilled. And for some of these locked conversations, like the one that's triggered after you complete your first run of Hades, for example, it's really important that this does actually get used when you next have a conversation with Nyx. That's suddenly become much, much more important than any of these other topics, and so, to bring this whole thing together and ensure the game's narrative does feel reactive, Supergiant also uses a priority system.
So events are sort of in a few different priority tiers, so that way I can ensure if some like critical story event happened, a character is going to respond to that instead of like, you know, talk about how that's a nice new weapon you have there or something like that.
This also allows for longer multi-part stories to be told across multiple conversations. If you talk to a character about something that needs to be broken up into different parts and then told in a certain order, this system can recognize that, okay, you've had part 1 of this conversation, let's now make sure that part 2 is considered a top priority, so the next time you speak with them, that particular storyline continues. Unless, of course, something even higher on that priority list ends up being triggered first. And that's how Supergiant ended up here, with a narrative experience that both responds to the players but also manages to avoid repetition for as long as possible. It's 4 things really: a massive script, a narrative system that embraces the genre's randomness, a ton of observations about what the player is actually up to, and finally you tie all of that together with a priority system that can make sure that characters do talk about what they're meant to talk about at the right times. Now, each of these ideas can be found in some form in the studio's previous work. Take Bastion, for example, way back in 2011. Not only did it introduce a narrator that could react to the player's actions, but it too had to solve the problem of players progressing at different speeds. That's why if you blast through an area really quickly, you'll notice the narration speeds up in an effort to match your progress, and it will even skip lines altogether if needed. And that same principle applies to Hades as well, although here we're talking about the narrative arc of an entire game rather than just a single level, and the way in which progress can differ is also significantly greater. In fact, only one other Supergiant game really competes with Hades on that front, and it's not Bastion, it's the high fantasy sports game Pyre.
It's hard for me to say if Hades was like a more complicated endeavor than Pyre, but I'll say if not for Pyre, Hades certainly wouldn't exist.
Pyre might not have anywhere near the same quantity of voice acting as Hades, but what it does have is an ensemble cast of characters that, depending on your actions, will either earn their freedom or not. And to put it simply, Pyre's storyline still needs to make sense to a player whether all of them have accomplished that goal, or if none of them have.
The ending of the game has 200 million different permutations narratively.
And so Pyre ends up with a narrative structure that looks like this, beginning in the same way for every single player, but rapidly branching out in different directions depending on which characters are available. Hades has its own version of this too, particularly when it comes to which of its Olympian gods are encountered and in what order. You'll always meet Athena first, but after her, with a few exceptions, it's then mostly left up to the player to decide, based on which chambers they want to clear.
But it was the first game experience that we've made where kind of after the first few minutes, we just let the game be the game, and kind of trust in the player and trust in ourselves, and also trust in the early access feedback to make sure we haven't gone completely astray.
Those are 2 words that kept cropping up, by the way, whenever I asked the team about how they made sense of this game. Early access.
Greg does a lot of work basically to make sure certain conversations that would make no sense don't appear and stuff like that. And a lot of that is because he knows how it's supposed to be, but some of that is because a player found a conversation that didn't make as much sense at a certain point in the narrative and now it won't appear. And maybe an alternate appears instead or something like that.
And so yes, Hades, just like Pyre, has this big branching narrative that keeps sprouting new appendages based on the actions of the player, but there's also one other wrinkle to consider.
So you can play Hades for 100 hours and never interact with the character of Orpheus, for example. You never have to free him, and even if you do free him, you never have to talk to him. You don't have to do anything. But he has this whole subplot with the character Eurydice that's a big kind of storyline. But like whether and when you've met Orpheus and Eurydice has a significant impact on how you enter that storyline.
The same goes for a bunch of characters. Take Nyx, for example. She's hugely important to Zag's storyline. In fact, in many ways, she's the catalyst for him trying to escape in the first place. And yet, it's entirely possible for a player to avoid speaking with her entirely until after they've experienced Hades' true ending. Now, are you going to have as good an experience with this game if you play like that? I don't think so, and to be honest, those are some very extreme examples which won't apply to the vast majority of this game's audience. But I think they're a good way of demonstrating how Supergiant is needed to think about the many different player experiences that Hades is meant to accommodate for. Is it a perfect system? No, of course not. There's always going to be a limit to how much new dialogue this game's characters can offer, and I'm sure some of you watching may have hit that point already. But I bet a lot of you haven't. And for a game that's been created by a relatively small team with this much superb voice acting and a storyline that players genuinely care about, that's one hell of an achievement. But seriously, Theseus needs to start treating that Minotaur with more respect. And I don't like his smile.
Speak for yourself, Asterius.
Maybe he would if you'd let him. Now I know what you're thinking. People make games sure does know a thing or two about set design. But I'll let you in on a little secret. We're incredibly cheap. That right here, that's a duvet cover that we ordered off Amazon and I've nailed to the wall. Today's video was sponsored by Skillshare, which is an online learning platform full of classes like this one from the music video director Christopher Rhodes, all about creating video on a budget. In that class he talks about his process when it comes to creating music videos for his clients, but a lot of what he has to say is applicable to all forms of video production. In fact, one thing that he taught me, which I'm very excited about, sorry, one second, is this app called Sunseeker, which allows you to see where in the sky the sun currently is, which if you're trying to film in front of natural light is useful information. If you hate making videos in a financially responsible manner, Skillshare also offers classes on all sorts of different topics, from bookkeeping to creative writing to game development. A premium membership typically costs less than $10 per month if you're on the annual plan, but the first 1,000 people to use this link in our video description can get a 14-day free trial if you'd like to have a nosy around first. Thank you so much for watching, and look at that. It says at midnight, for example, the sun will be directly below us. I think I knew that one already. And finally, a huge thank you to our patrons, some of which you can see over here. I like having a quill as a prop, that's fun. We could not do this without you, and we really appreciate your support. And if you're new to the channel, then you can find another video that we did just below. What is Blaseball? Why are people excited about it? Do you need to know that information? Yes, click the video if you'd like to find out. And until next time, I feel like there's a wand or something now. Goodbye.